If you've wondered why data catalogs might be important, if you consider, for those of us who have been in software engineering for a long time, it seems like back in the old days, we used to have a single source of truth, which was basically contained in a monolith database, think Oracle or DB2 or Informix. And this database used to be the core of our entire information storage ability. Basically, it was the source of truth for our entire organization. It was also one of the largest sources of our licensing fees as well. But today, particularly thanks to the exploding adoption of microservices, we have databases for every purpose, for analytics, for document storage, or even for feature storage if you're doing ML. Some databases are relational, some are columnar, some are denormalized, some are aggregated, some are metastores or materialized views on top of other data or databases as well. So with this simultaneous fragmentation and proliferation of data, the data itself is spread across smaller silos all over the organization, meaning teams face increasing challenges in making efficient use of the data that they have. Hence, data discovery becomes a key issue that many scaling data and business teams face. So here today to talk about data discovery challenges and how a data catalog can solve this problem is Mark Grover. So as I mentioned, Mark is the co-creator of Amundsen, which is a data catalog that's been open sourced at Lyft, where he's also a product manager. And previously, Mark has also been a committer to various open source data related Apache projects for quite a good number of years. Before Lyft, he was a software engineer at Cloudera for 5 years, where he worked primarily on Spark streaming. So Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Pete. Super excited to be here.
For 5 years, where we worked primarily on Spark streaming. So Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Pete. Super excited to be here.
I'm getting some echo here. Let me just fix that. There we go. Sorry about that, Mark. So one of the things that Mark, is Data Council as a community. And so today we have a bunch of people tuning in live. And as an experiment, we decided that we wanted to make this interactive as possible, and both hear from listeners regarding their data cataloging and data discovery challenges, and also take questions from the audience a little bit more in real time than we did last time, or last time we waited till the end of the show. So I just wanted to encourage the attendees out there to stay active in the chat. We're going to be asking you some poll-like questions that you can just sound off on in the chat, and we'll aggregate responses to the best of our ability. And we're also going to take as many questions that you have for Mark as well, which potentially can even shape the conversation. So please stay active in the chat, and we'll do our best to make use of that signal. So Mark, just to kick things off, I wanted to ask you, why is data discovery a big deal? You've thought about this problem a lot. You've seen lots of different modern organizations. Why does this problem exist, and what attracted you to it?
Yeah. What I found at Lyft and many other organizations is that there are two kinds of growth that leads to some pain in understanding and finding what trustworthy data I can use for my work. And so we can start with what the work looks like. So the work can be an analysis that's done by an analyst, or it could be writing an ML model that's done by a data scientist. But for that work, regardless of what the downstream analytical or ML use case is, you had to find what is a trustworthy source for data for me to use. And like you alluded to, one big reason for this is that organizations are increasing the amount of data they're putting in their various databases. In particular, the one that I was super intent on looking at was the analytical databases. And then even there, even just like the one database, you would find that different teams are putting different kinds of data, and you don't quite know which one is the right one for you to use. The second one is that the number of people who are coming into the organization or leaving the organization or changing their roles is also very important, right? So that's the other sort of reason where you don't have this central one person or a few people, small team where you can go ask all these questions, right? So the main problem is, what data can I trust for my work? And once I have found it, how do I understand what each of the fields and attributes and the statistics and the shape of the data that I need to know in order to do a productive job at my work? And that was the problem that I found was taking 25 to 30% of people's time when they were doing their work. And that was clearly way too much and not productive.
Got it. Well, I just want to pause here and send out a bit of a micro poll to the audience, asking folks to sound off. How many people listening out there actually have a data discovery problem? If you can just respond in the chat, that'll be a helpful signal for us. So Mark, before we get into more about the data catalog, I want to salute you on your choice of name for the product. I grew up in northern Minnesota, and I sort of had a lot of Norwegian and Scandinavians living around me. And so Roald Amundsen was kind of a household name because he was a great Norwegian explorer who was quite a geographical hacker. He was the one who figured out how to take sled dogs to the South Pole. And growing up, we had a pack of sled dogs in our backyard that we would run around the neighborhood. So anyway, I just wanted to salute you for that. That little tip of the hat to some Scandinavians out there and let you know that the Scandinavian here appreciated that.
Thank you. Yeah, the credit goes to an engineer on the team, Beto, who came up with that name, he's a geographic nerd himself. I think the hard part about the name is that if you aren't from that part of the world or super familiar, it's super hard to say, super hard to spell, super hard to like do anything with. So
I get it. Well, obscure names are the focus of many software engineering teams. So well done there. So Mark, like what was it that sort of led you to this problem space? Because one of the things that I find that's super interesting are the origin stories of these projects, and in sort of projects that take on a larger than life component or become sort of a force of nature, like it sounds like Amundsen has. I'm wondering, like, what was it that dragged you into this space? Like what's a quick version of that story?
Yeah, I think the quick version would be spending a lot of time with the users in this case. So I was lucky enough to spend time and looking and understanding the workflows of some key data scientists at Lyft, and also was lucky enough to see what were some of the shared problems across the industry, looking at companies like Airbnb and Facebook and LinkedIn, and sort of figuring out if these challenges here are something that's just at Lyft, maybe because of organizational structure or something specific to Lyft, or are they broader, right? And so I would answer that question in two parts. One was understanding the user pain and workflow. And the second one was an understanding if this is like something broader than just Lyft or something specific to the organization I was a part of.
And how many teams would you say are using Amundsen right now?
Yeah, so when we started Amundsen, it was obviously closed source. We had thought of potentially making it open source later on, but the goal was to solve the problem for the data scientists that left, right? And that number grew organically. And so the number of weekly actives for Amundsen is actually, almost 700 weekly actives every week. And that's within the company. Since then, Amundsen is open source, and there are about 20 organizations outside of Lyft that use it, the likes of Square, ING, Edmunds.com, Reddit. And so these organizations are using mostly for data discovery. There's one organization, Square, who's taken Amundsen, and we can talk more about this later in the conversation too, but they've taken Amundsen and actually used it for a slightly different use case, and they're using it for security and access management.
Got it. In one of your previous data council talks, I saw the graph of Amundsen use at Lyft. I think it's the one that's going up and up and up, and then all of a sudden it drops to like almost zero, and then it goes up and up and up. And of course, the drop to zero was Christmas, I think, of 2019 or 18. Right.
Yeah.
So perfectly understandable. But like in the most meaningful sense, it's really just been up and to the right. What do you think has gotten the business so excited about Amundsen at Lyft? How do people use it, and how has it made their jobs infinitely easier?
Yeah, I think of Amundsen actually as a marketplace. It started off like focusing on understanding the workflow of a data scientist, but really you have signals that come from the data engineering team, and they also use the data in Amundsen for discovering what data sets they need to use to do their pipeline development, but also for the data sets they create, it acts as a communication mechanism between the data engineering team and the users of this data, which is usually data scientist or analyst or operations people. And so those are the main ways it's used here at Lyft, is to understand what data is trustworthy through automated signals. And I think that was the key sort of difference too. Previously, there are some tools that exist in the industry, but they rely a lot on curated metadata. So if I'm the data engineer and Pete's the data analyst, the data engineer is going to use this data set. It's like good for you, right? And I have to like put in all the descriptions and ownership information. It's like a lot of work that's painful. And so what Amundsen relies on is, can I get some of this information automatically and use that as a proxy for trust? So an example is, can I get how often a data set is queried and use that to power the search ranking, so that even though I haven't gotten like this rubber stamp on every single table, right? I still have a good sense of what's most commonly used in the company, and therefore a good sense of like trustworthiness. That's not to say that we should take out the human signals, right? Human signals sometimes are important, and they are often very important, but the tool doesn't entirely rely on human signals.
Yeah, I think the point here is that, and one of the things I've discovered through listening to some of your other interviews is that search popularity and search relevance aren't always the same thing, or data popularity and data relevance might be more correct to say. How do you distinguish between those two in the way that you surface search results through the Amundsen product? Because at its core, it's a search interface for data. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. Yeah, my favorite example to give about relevance versus popularity is, say you go to Google and you search for Apple, right? And if Google shows you an orange as a result, then that's not a relevant result, right? But if it showed you the fruit apple as a result, then that's the relevant result. But honestly, maybe when you type Apple, you're actually perhaps not searching for the fruit, you're searching for the computer company, right? And that's where popularity comes in. So maybe I match two results with Apple, the fruit and the computer company. But depending on the context, the team you work in, or what you usually search for, I know that perhaps you're searching for the computer company, right? And then you can take this analogy to the data world, and you can say like, okay, you search for the rides table or the bikes table or something like that. But then when you type in some more information like weekly rides or something like that, can we use that information in the context where you sit in the organization to power a search experience that's related to you, and using existing automated signals to provide trustworthy information back to you?
Got it. So we have a question already coming in, a couple questions actually. The first of which is, does Lyft plan to leave the Russian taxi market, which might be beyond your purview?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to answer that question.
But thank you for all the questions out there. Another one that I think, Mark, you might have more to say about, regarding other commercial solutions such as Elation or Calibra, which I wanted to ask you as well, because there's a whole host of commercial and open source solutions. LinkedIn has Data Hub. There's one from Netflix. I forget, was it
Metacat?
Metacat, there you go. So there's a bunch of options. How do you compete or compare, contrast yourself against those things that the teams are considering as well?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we did that analysis when we started Amundsen. We continue to do that analysis periodically. I'll share my perspective. Maybe it's best to start with the commercial vendors first, and then we can go to the open source category. So the commercial space, there are a few vendors that were called out earlier. I think there are two main things that were in our requirements for Amundsen that we didn't find these vendors meet. The first one was that we wanted less human signal on an ongoing basis in order to power trustworthy experience, right? And like I said before, there were tools that like require a human to go and put on all this information, but we were, for example, key decisions like using the query logs to parse out who's using it, connecting that to the HR database and figuring out like how far they are from your HR chain, and using that to power an experience was super important to us. And so that was one main reason, is like relying on automated usage and metadata as much as possible. The second reason was that we realized that once we had this metadata, we would want to use it for other purposes, right? So we would want to send programmatically metadata to this. So for example, in Lyft's case, we have some ML pipelines that actually programmatically tag certain data sets with certain tags. But we also want to access this data programmatically. And you're seeing this in Square's use case, where they're taking the metadata that's present in Amundsen with certain tags on columns to then, like, these tags are things like whether it's column is personal or PII, and then using it to then determine if this individual who's requesting access to this data set should get access to it, right? And so that use case is not possible unless you have programmatic access to the metadata, right? And that was one other requirement that we didn't see commercial solutions fulfilling.
And on that note, one of the most fascinating things I think about Amundsen is where you get this real-time data. Obviously, you're scraping lots of different data stores and data sources across the org. I've also heard that you ingest Presto logs in order to figure out access patterns to determine which data actually might fit that popularity query. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. The first version of Amundsen got two kinds of metadata. The first kind was, like you said, from the table metadata. So think of it like information schema from your Postgres database, tables in the columns. And the second kind was scraping the Presto logs or database query logs in order to determine what tables are highly queried and by whom, right? So we have a graph database backing Amundsen, which then uses nodes and edges between various things. So there are nodes for a table and column, but then there are connections between tables themselves, between people who access the table, and then the weight of search is determined by this activity. I do want to point out that as Amundsen has matured, we are getting a lot more metadata. So a few other sources of metadata we have added are airflow information. So you can see which DAG generated this table and sort of link the airflow DAG to the Amundsen page. But then we also have information around ownership, which can obviously be represented different places for a different organization, but you have that metadata in the graph structure. And then depending on how your organization stores that information, you grab that in. We now have information about dashboards. So one problem we saw that is like, okay, we help you do new analysis, but what about analysis that has already existed in the past? How do you discover that, right? And so we recently added functionality for what we called Amundson Dashboards, which means you can search for previously existing work through the same capability. And instead of using the query count, we use view count and run count to determine what may be relevant. So those are examples of metadata we have added more recently. I'm sure I'm missing a few, but.
So this design decision to use a graph database, that's fascinating to me. How did you arrive at that decision? Did you try other things before you set on a graph database?
We made that decision because we felt that the representation of the structure here was logically a graph, and the way we wanted to access it was very, very akin to graph queries. We had also seen some prior work here. For example, Airbnb has a data portal, and they had chosen to use a graph database. Facebook has an internal product that's very similar to this, and they use a graph, unsurprisingly for Facebook, perhaps. And so there was some intuition based on our patterns, but also some validation based on how other companies with closed source products had chosen about their design.
So based on this graph concept, I want to dig into this a bit more, because first of all, it's fascinating to me that you modeled all these relationships in a graph. It makes perfect sense when you think about it. But what about the extra functionality that it might enable. I've heard you talk before about how when a user is discovering which data set they might, or which data element they might want to use at Lyft, not only can they see sort of the popularity of that column, some statistics on that column, which systems or DAGs might access it, but you can also take it down to the person level. And so there's this notion of people being in the graph and data power users at Lyft surfacing as potentially institutionalized sources or repositories themselves of personal information as to how that column or that data set might be used. Is this particularly powerful, and do you find people discovering each other across the organization based on this feature?
Very much so. Yeah, I think this was one realization we learned, was that it's very important to have people in the graph. And also, I will give credit to Airbnb here. They were also putting people in their graph, and that triggered an idea for us too. It is definitely very useful. So if I'm joining your team, Pete, I'm like coming in and saying like, oh, what data sets and what analysis does Pete usually do, right? So I can just go to Pete's page and figure out what tables or dashboards you have bookmarked, what tables or dashboards you most commonly query, and this information is very useful as new team members are onboarding to existing teams. It's almost like, I remember every time I've joined a new organization, I want to always look at my peers' Google groups or mailing lists they've joined, just so I'm not missing out on any information. And I feel the exact same way about this data world. Like I want to see my team leads or my peers' commonly used data sets, commonly used dashboards to actually onboard to the team really quickly. It's super helpful.
Well, if you had asked me 3 months ago whether this problem would be useful at startups or at big companies, I would have thought, oh, this is a big company thing. This is a big company problem. Lots of data, fragmented data sources, growing team. You don't know who all the players are. But now in this sort of semi-permanent work from home era, at least that we're facing now, it seems like even medium-sized teams or smaller teams would benefit from tools like Amundsen, because you can discover a lot more intuitively about the system, about the data, and about the key players than you would be, since lots of teams onboarding and orientation schemes sitting next to each other and sharing coffees and having conversations have gone out the window.
Absolutely, yeah. I think historically I've found that there needs to be a certain amount of for lack of a better word, chaos in the company for something like this to make sense. And this chaos can come from like not everybody understanding like the data that's being produced at a really fast pace, or people having a different understanding of the data sets, or people joining the company really fast. So a fast growing company, you don't want to rely on tribal knowledge of certain people because that bogs the company down, right? And so I think if you have any of those problems, something like this makes sense. Now, as I was saying, Amundsen can integrate a lot of metadata, and each of these metadata provides incremental value to you. So the first one is the information schema style metadata, and the second one is the query logs, and then there were a whole bunch of other ones. And you would find that as your organization grows, that more and more metadata resources would become more and more relevant to you. But to start off, you could start off something really simple with just one or two kinds of metadata and power that through for a small organization. And then as time goes on, you can add on these additional data integration points for metadata.
Got it. So let's go to a couple more questions. Ramakrishna is asking about technical metadata versus business metadata. Would you say that Amundsen serves tech folks more than business folks, or how do you sort of see the use case split across who is best served by Amundsen currently?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ramakrishna. So maybe I'll take the business folks, because I think people may mean different things on business folks. So I'm going to break that term down into roles, perhaps. So I would talk about 3 roles: data engineer, no doubt that's a technical role; data scientist or analyst. Don't know where that fit. I think different people put it in different category. And the third one is maybe an operator, right? So this is your marketing ops person or finance ops person, right? Pretty clearly business person. Okay, so I want to say the first version of Amundsen is focused on the data engineer and the data scientist. Yeah, relatively technical people. And the metadata it still contains is actually business related, right? So if I have a column called ETA, right? If you've taken a Lyft ride, I show you ETA like 15 times, right? When you're like opening up your app, I'm like, oh, the driver is like 3 minutes away. And then as you go through the funnel of requesting the ride, like I show you ETA different times. And when you actually have clicked request ride, there's the real ETA, right? So if a column is called ETA, you still had to understand what this ETA means, but perhaps still a fairly technical definition. So the first version of Amundsen focused on data sets and these technical producers and consumers of data. What we are doing with Amundsen now, especially with dashboards, is that we are going into a world where a business user who usually operates in the world of dashboards, right? Because if they need to get a new dashboard, they will work with the data engineering team or the data science team to get that dashboard. But they want to see what dashboards are out there. Who is using this dashboard? Can I use it too, right? And that, especially with the dashboard world, is a new foray. And I would say that in our journey of solving the technical people problem, we're fairly far along, but we're just beginning to think about the journey for solving it for the more business folk.
Got it. And what about, sort of related to that, but going back to the technical side, what about machine learning use cases? Are you tracking feature stores? Are you tracking machine learning metadata? Are you tracking any kinds of labeling or tagging of data? How does Amundsen currently relate to any machine learning activity at Lyft? Is that a specific integration point?
Yeah, that's another great question. That is a work in progress. We have historically been data set focused, and now we're exploring what it means for features. What we do store today is the offline features, because they happen to be stored in the same data store that we store the analytical data in. So by virtue of that, you get them. However, a big problem in the ML world is linking the online and the offline features, and we don't have that ability today. It's something, as we invest more in feature discovery, we would explore. Another thing to keep in mind here is model discovery. So just like we went from tables to dashboard, the equivalent in the ML world is features to models. And you may also depends on organizational preferences. You may be in a world in which you actually don't want people to discover features, but you want people to actually look at the existing models and reuse features that already exist, right? And so I think we are still working on figuring that part out, and it's a work in progress on an ongoing basis.
And what about streaming systems? Would you have a similar answer for streaming systems? Is that kind of work in progress, or are there other specific considerations just for general data streaming overall?
Yeah, that comes up quite often, which is indexing things like streams or Kafka topics and the schemas associated with them. We already index schemas that go downstream and create a table. So oftentimes you have data flowing through Kafka, then ultimately lands in a table in Hive or something like that. And we index that so you can actually see the comments that were associated upstream and trickle them down all the way to the pipeline. In cases where the Kafka topic is just used for a Flink job or Spark streaming job or something like that, we don't cater to that use case. It's mostly been not because it's not important, but the amount of data and the amount of options you have in an analytical data store like Hive or Presto or something like that is like a 10 or 100 times more than the number of topics you may have in Kafka, right? So we anticipate we'll get to that problem, but the static data set batch compute problem was actually much more timely to solve given the amount of data that existed in that space.
Got it. Well, I see we're getting great interaction from the audience. A bunch of people signed it off and said they definitely had data discovery problems. So Mark, let's follow that up with a follow-up question. For those folks that would say you have, or currently or in the past, data discovery problems, we're wondering what stage you're at now. Are you at the sort of do nothing stage and just recognize you have a problem? Are you at the exploring stage where you're exploring solutions, or are you at perhaps have you found a solution? So those would be the three potential answers. You're at the beginning, you're exploring, or you've actually found a solution. So you can sound off in the chat and we'll continue to take questions from the audience as well. So Mark, CJ is asking about data quality. How is that measured and enforced? And I have a few questions sort of surrounding this as well, and sort of what the edges of the Amundsen purview are. But do you want to talk about data quality for a second first, and how Amundsen might be used there?
Yeah, so the way I think about data quality is actually unrelated to Amundsen on the first glance, right? So the idea is that different data sets require different quality metrics, and they're based on the consumption patterns and the production patterns of these data sets, right? So if I have a data set and I agree with the owner that this particular, as a consumer, I agree with the owner, this particular field should never be null, right? Or this particular, this data set should always have row count between a certain standard, like 3 standard deviations of the last 2 weeks running count, right? We agree on this. That's my definition of a data quality contract. And then I either miss or meet that contract, right? And what people care about is how, in the context of data discovery, is like, how often do you meet that contract? And can I trust it, right? So the way I see this is like there's a separate system for having data quality contracts and meeting them. And then that system ingests the metadata into Amundsen, which is then used to power as an additional metadata signal to power what data sets are high quality and the discovery and the curation experience of that.
So in that sense, Amundsen is just a catalog of the metrics, the data metrics as they exist. It's a source of truth regarding this metadata, but it's not in and of itself enforcing quality contracts or perhaps sending alerts when data goes, quote, bad or missing. It's just a sort of exploratory tool to be able to discover those things, and the other quality system could be adjacent to that.
That's right. Yeah, and they share the same metadata. So I think the other point to note here is that Amundsen has 4 pieces in the architecture. There's a front-end application. That's what most people see in the blog posts and presentations. There's the graph database, which we've talked a bit about. There's an Elasticsearch cluster with a whole bunch of search magic. And then the 4th piece is a data builder system, which is either a crawler where you can pull metadata in, or a push model where someone can push metadata. This, the graph that I was talking about, the data map or the data graph, that graph is shared between the data quality system and the data discovery system. So think of it as this layer of metadata that's powering multiple applications. And the first application is just data discovery, which is Amundsen. But the graph underneath is shared with the data quality system. So they can interoperate on the same graph. The vision for just the data discovery app is this, think of it like Facebook for your data exploration, right? So you have your data set. If there's an ongoing incident happening, it shows you the metadata. If there is a failed data quality check, it shows you the metadata. It shows any recent changes that may have happened on this data set. It shows a feed of like information or contracts on the data set and how often they're being met. Who else is using this data set, all this work. And so you go to this place to actually stay on top of what's happening with your data set and what new things are created in the work that you are doing. But I think the key point here is that the underlying metadata graph is shared that powers multiple applications.
Yeah, so in that scenario, I'm thinking of a data lineage app. I'm thinking of a data monitoring app, right? We're thinking of a data quality app, and those could all be different end user applications built against a common metastore. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, and that was one surprise learning for me, was to work with the Amundsen team at Lyft and put out this open source project, but then have Square taken in a completely different direction, right? Which is relying on the same metadata and parts of the data discovery application, but they modify the application where you are now tagging various columns as PII or not, and then hitting the same graph database in the background programmatically to then allow or deny access to people who are trying to access a certain data set.
And this is the security use case that you mentioned previously at the beginning of the show?
Yeah, that's the same.
Yeah, got it. So let's stick with the graph for a bit and sort of the data crawler part of the system. Since we have another follow-up question from CJ, he's asking if there's an ontology that guides metadata acquisition.
Hmm. CJ, the way I'm taking this question, please chime back in on chat if this is not the way you wanted it to go, was that maybe a glossary of business terms that are guiding how we capture metadata. We currently, this is a commonly asked request for us, but we currently don't have a pattern for this. Our current solution around ontology is that, maybe give you a concrete example. So oftentimes in organizations, you have different ways to refer to the same logical thing, right? And so like an ETA may also be called an ETD. I'm just making this up, by the way, not, totally made up example. Or a passenger may be called a PAX or a passenger or a rider, And so you have to link all these terms together to the same sort of definition. And what we do is currently in tables, we use tags in order to get around that. So we would say, if the table name is called rider, we would tag it with PAX and passenger. So when someone searches for any of those terms, it pushes you towards the rider table.
Got it. And on a related topic, Mark, what are the current data sources that you support? I assume there's a lot of work in creating the ingesters. Although I believe you've used some open source in the back end on data crawler as well. Is that where you use Goblin?
Yeah, that's where we use Goblin, and it was a Goblin-inspired architecture based on some of the engineers in the team had worked in LinkedIn in the past, and you may have seen talks from them. Jin and Tao specifically had worked at LinkedIn, and they were pretty inspired by the architecture. So it uses a Goblin-inspired architecture in the back, and then in terms of extractors, they're super broad, and I don't know if I can give an exhaustive list, but any database connector that's pretty commonly used, it's connected. So you can connect to things like Hive Metastore, which powers any big data style database like Hive and Presto and Impala. But we also have connectors to Snowflake, BigQuery, Druid, Cassandra, MySQL, Athena, Amazon Glue. And then we also have a generic SQL connector based on Alchemy, which you can use to connect to any database that I may not have named right now. So the list is fairly broad. In terms of dashboard connections, we connect currently to Mode, but that a lot of organizations in the Amundsen open source community have extended that to connect to Tableau or Looker. In the HR sort of people space, we connect to a system that we have an API to an internal system that's our HR database, but that API can be extended to work with Workday pretty easily. And those are, and we have a pretty heavy integration with Airflow for our ETL and DAG information. So those are some of the salient connectors we have.
Got it. So Airflow's come up a couple times. Are there other tools in the data ecosystem that you commonly sort of see being implemented surrounding Amundsen? I guess the pattern question from this show is what other tools do you play nicely with?
Yeah, I think Airflow for Amundsen is used in two ways. One is to actually capture metadata. So data engineers, for example, could see how their DAGs and their tables are related. It also helps us in the future get metadata like this data set just got delivered, or this data set is running late and missing the SLA, things of that nature, which are super useful to the data scientists and analysts. Amundsen also has ETL jobs in the background for generating stats, for capturing this metadata and building the search index. And all of those in the back also use Airflow. In terms of other tools in the ecosystem that Amundsen plays nicely with, I would say that the graph, one point I should mention is the graph database is actually replaceable, right? So all of these 4 pieces I was talking about in the architecture are microservices. So you can actually take one out and keep the other 3 around. And so one thing that we see commonly is that people will take the graph database out and plug in their own existing solution for metadata capturing. A common existing solution for organizations that have been around for a while are things like Apache Atlas. And this goes back to the other part of the question we were asking earlier, is like compared to commercial as well as open source solutions. So maybe this is a good segue into that. But you can take, if your organization already has existing investment in Atlas, you keep the other three parts of Amundsen around and you replace the graph store with Atlas. And that's exactly what ING has done, right? ING has a lot of organizational buy-in and work that's gone into Atlas over the last 5 to 10 years. And then they're using Amundsen and they're replacing it, the graph database, with Atlas. So we see a good chunk of that as well. There's one company in the community, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to share, but they are replacing the graph database with the Amazon version of the graph. I think it's called Neptune or Titan or something like that. I can't remember the name. And so and that one is not, they will still use the model that Amundsen provides. It was just that they wanted to choose a different underlying storage instead of the current free edition of Neo4j that Amundsen comes with.
Yeah, obviously some teams have investments in infrastructure and other kinds of data stores that might be more meaningful for them to support in this capacity. So Mark, I want to switch gears a little bit because, and we didn't talk about this previously, but you're one of these sort of unique crosses between an engineer and a product manager. And it's become apparent to me just in chatting with you about Amundsen, the use cases, some of this plugin architecture, some of the strategic sense that you have around where this project could go. You possess this sort of split brain between the implementation of the engineer, but the strategy of the product manager. Do you have any thoughts on, like, first of all, is that a thing? Did I articulate that correctly? And secondly, it's always been one of my beliefs that open source projects need project managers, or they need some vision of where the project is going. And sometimes that's naturally embodied in the leader of the project, but sometimes the leader of the project is very much an engineer and doesn't sort of have that ability or that interest in communicating a cohesive roadmap to the community. Can we talk about that for a second? Do you have any opinions or thoughts on that?
Man, that's a great point. I actually will start off by saying that I'm mostly a product manager. I used to be an engineer, and what I am saying here is actually learning from a huge team of a small team of really capable engineers, right? So there are team members, Taujan, Tamika, Daniel, Shengu, Alagapan, who are, and then there are many more that have worked at various times in the project and then gone off to do other things. And so what I'm sharing is simply a curation of information sometimes and learnings from them. And by no means do I represent like the single voice in the project. In terms of open source communities, yeah, I think I have seen communities function well where there is one organization really moving the charter of the project. And usually within that one organization, you have one or two people who are owners of that project. They bring the passion and the resilience to move this project forward, right? For them, it's more than just a job. It is like solving this problem. I'm super excited about it, and I want to help others solve the same problem too, right?
And I vision, know, right? It's probably like there's vision in that like magical sort of mix. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, working with the Amundsen team at Lyft, that I share that same sentiment with every single person in the team, right? And it just so happens that I have perhaps more interest in coming to a podcast, but I think that the vision is shared between the team, and we continue to iterate on it together. So I definitely by no means would say that I'm the engineering architect. I think the team is the engineering architect of the project. And I've been more of the person who's spending a lot of time understanding the user's workflows and sort of working with the team to figure out creative solutions to solve those problems.
That's great. So here's another question from Ronglian. He's asking, is Amundsen specifically integrated with DBT?
Oh, great question. This comes up every once in a while. And we do know that we have some shared users. And DBT provides information like lineage that can be captured in the Amundsen graph. But I don't know at the top of my mind, what that current status is and how those users that use Amundsen and DBT are using them together. I think that would be a great data point where you could get integration from tool like DBT into the metadata graph and have a discovery and trust experience on the other side of that. That would be a great place for us to explore. And something where this is a place where contributions are greatly welcome, because in my day-to-day work, we don't use DBT and Amundsen directly. So really relying on others to actually educate us and take the project in a direction that could serve your use case.
Yeah, suffice it to say that DBT could act on any data that Amundsen also acts on. But as you said, tracking the transformations inside the Amundsen graph that were affected by DBT, could potentially be a fun integration. On that note, our next guest on the show will be Drew from Fishtown Analytics to talk about DBT. So thanks, Ramlin, for that question. DBT is hugely popular in our community, and we know that, and we're great supporters of each other, Fishtown and Data Council. And so Drew will be the next guest on the show, so stay tuned for that.
Yeah, Drew is phenomenal.
Absolutely. And he might be listening. So, so Mark, like, what are the main things, sort of as we wrap up, because as you know, our goal is to keep these chats well under an hour. Sometimes we're closer to an hour and sometimes we're not. But we don't want people to be married to their Zoom for too long, even though it's a sort of a work from home world right now. What are the things that you're looking for from the community, and how can the Data Council community help with Amundsen?
Yeah, absolutely. Amundsen, as you know, is an open source project. We have a community of about 600 individuals right now from various different companies. I would imagine probably around 100 companies. 20 of them use Amundsen heavily, contribute to the project. We think this is a problem bigger than just 20 companies, right? And we want you, if you have this problem, try this project out. Check out the GitHub link, join the Slack channel. Community is super helpful in helping each other out as you're onboarding or as you're contributing features, and use it for your use case, right? I've seen communities take projects in the past in a slightly different direction than the originator organization hadn't thought about, and that's happened to Amundsen as well. And I think it would be great to see what you see this project as and share your ideas and direction on where this could help with integrations or more metadata or direction. So like, come contribute, learn, share insight, share feedback. Would love for you to be a part of the community.
Great, and we'll be posting those links in the chat window and in the show notes so that you can check out the Amundsen and their Slack community as well. So Mark, as we wrap up, tell me something that you're most proud of about Amundsen, besides perhaps just its usage and the adoption it's seen. Is there something that was technically challenging or hard or interesting that you're particularly satisfied with the solution that you and the team created?
Yeah, I think the team spent a lot of time. One thing that the team did was they actually did a quick hackathon off the project. So actually, first version of Amundsen was built in 2 weeks, and it was the super scrappiest, craziest, like embarrassingly short version of Amundsen, just to see where there are technical roadblocks or places that we wanted to learn from quickly. And the team did a fantastic job of that. And I think that was a great learning for me, is like when you have a lot of ambiguity in the future of the technical direction, like this can really help with that. And then obviously we threw that version away and rebuilt the whole thing from scratch, but we knew what we were doing. So, and I think the team also was super thoughtful in building an extensible graph model that could accommodate various different kinds of metadata as we went on, right? And making sure that that metadata was grabbable and puttable by Amundsen, the data discovery app, which is the first app that took this metadata, but also usable by other applications in a programmatic manner, which I think is one of the key differentiators of Amundsen, that you don't have to use this metadata through a UI app, but you could augment and use it through other means.
That's great. Well, Mark, thanks for coming on the show, and it's been great to talk to you about Amundsen. We're looking forward to seeing more updates, and feel free to keep the community posted. Where can folks find you? Is Twitter best, or in the Amundsen Slack, or what other channels are you available?
Twitter is great. Amundsen Slack channel is awesome. Use either of those, and we look forward to talking to you more.
Well, thanks, Mark. We'll look forward to seeing you in the community soon.